Thanks so much, Aaron, for that that generous introduction. I should say, follow me on Twitter for the next couple of weeks before the whole thing implodes. But so far it's still in operation. I want to start just by saying what a pleasure it is to be here and speaking to this community. I have followed the Rachel Carson Center as a kind of imaginary, mystical place that I keep hearing about people going to and doing all these amazing things. And I am extremely pleased and grateful to have the opportunity to be here as a member of this community and speaking with this group. And I'd also like to, in particular, to thank Christoph and the wonderful vision and imagination that he brings to this community and these projects. And a shout out to my friends and housemates at the Land House. You might not know which of us came in from the Land House this morning, but if you look for the mud on the shoes, that's the giveaway that there are some of us who came in from the farm. So thanks very much. I'm very excited to give you guys a little taste of this Introduction to the Blue Humanities project, which is both a new project and also an outgrowth of some of the work I've been doing for the past dozen years or more. And I have one little anecdote before I go to the formal paper, which is about the title of the talk. So when Ariel asked me for a title, I instantly wrote back, the title is What Are the Blue Humanities? But then I realized that usually I think of the Blue Humanities as a singular collective, and so the title should have been What is the Blue Humanities? And I think we actually corrected it for one of the posters, but not the other. So it's says one thing on the website and one thing on the poster that's upstairs on the fourth floor. So I'm going to go with what are the Blue Humanities? And I also am going to talk a little bit later about the question of singularity and plurality for terms like humanities and also poetics, which is the subtitle of the talk, which is Toward a Poetics of Planetary Water. But before I get to that question about singularity and plurality, I'm going to start, and this is going to be the opening movement in the book itself, but I'm going to start back at my home in the northeastern United States on the Connecticut shoreline, a place that I'm actually missing a little bit right now as I am here. And I love it in Munich, but I've been also thinking a little bit about my local waters, which I'm going to talk about now at the opening of this talk. So, and I will give you a slide of my local waters, a photo I took earlier this spring. Twice each month, near the spring tides, I walk down to the low point of Beckett Avenue, where I watch the ocean bubble up through a sewer grate. Depending on when exactly I get there and what direction the wind is blowing at that moment, the water might be a damp oval leaching out from the sewer, or the whole street might be covered to a depth of about 5 or 10 centimeters. That road doesn't get a whole lot of car traffic, and it usually remains passable for dog walkers like me, except a few times a year when the whole road is basically shut off because of big storms or particularly high tides. A slow exhalation of water from the ocean passes through an underground tunnel and bubbles up out of the grate onto the street, generating the slow, wet pulse of Short Beach, the little coastal neighborhood where I live. The water pools in predictable shapes, fitting itself into slight gradations in the asphalt. It moves subtly in response to wind and the tides that roll shoreward from the open water of Long Island Sound, which is about 10 meters away from this part of the road on the other side of a row of beach houses. Sunny day flooding overspills the road only in this one place, a low point on the road just opposite a public park. Here, at the bottom of the neighborhood, the sea invades the land, following the rhythm of the tides twice every day. That geographic invasion provides physical evidence, wet and salty, of the presence of sea in this ordinary Connecticut suburb. Other evidence isn't far to seek. A few hundred meters back from the coast, the last stub of the New Haven electric trolley follows a raised railroad bed through the salt marsh. part of the old F trolley line that the Connecticut company operated between New Haven and Brantford from 1900 through 1947, when the automobile craze shut it down. This last mile of functioning trolley track crosses the salt marsh about a block behind my house. As I walk along the tracks, the tide's inflating lungs follow me, alternately filling and draining the marsh. Living near Long Island Sound means that I don't see any appreciable surf on my local beach, but we average a tidal range of between 4 and 2 meters in each cycle. My favorite thing to do when I'm home is to swim in the ocean. And during the warmer half of the year, usually, and this picture is from August 2020, I swim at high tide every day. I keep it to high tide so I can avoid the silt and the mud which is exposed at low tide, and also the oysters. Some days welcome me with afternoon high tides with plenty of time to splash into the water right after a full day's work. But some days I need to take an early morning dip, and sometimes I have to wait until the water rolls up to a swimming depth in the late afternoon when I really should be walking the dog or cooking dinner for my family. I prefer the mid-morning tides, but I like the cycle. I like tracing the tidal changes through each month. All year, I watch the water crawl up and then recede, staining the sand, filling the marsh, flooding the paved road. The saltwater and salt marsh geography of Short Beach frames the book from which this talk is drawn. Much of what will be in an introduction to the Blue Humanities was written either on those shores or more recently here at the RCC, mostly out on the farm. Since the Blue Humanities as an intellectual discourse is primarily an oceanic phenomenon, growing out of explorations of how humans relate to the saltwater film that covers most of our planet, it makes sense to begin thinking about this project here, at this salty place, at high tide, swimming or walking down the hill to see how much of the road is flooded. But my personal geography does not begin to exhaust the waters with which this book engages. Even the whole world ocean represents only most, not all, of the water on the planet and in this book. So, this very busy and I think pretty illegible slide is a table of contents of the whole project. And if you can't read it, that's fine. It outlines all the chapters and contents of the book that brought me to the RCC this fall. As the table shows, each chapter engages with 2 different bodies of water, one large and salty, and the other smaller and fresh. Each chapter also takes up a physical property, water's polarity, its global currents, its buoyancy, and other things, to explore how this substance shapes human and non-human life and experiences. Each chapter engages with several primary water texts, as well as splashing through a single chosen chapter of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, perhaps the English language's greatest hymn to oceanic vastness and the human desires that oceans spur. These 5 elements, saltwater, freshwater, a physical property, primary texts, and a chapter from Moby Dick, comprise the backbone of each of the book's 10 chapters. These objects, texts, and properties provide a structure through which I try to describe the intellectual, creative, and artistic currents in the Blue Humanities. They also, and this was why I think the illegibility of the slide is actually kind of helpful for us here, but in the plurality and messy overflows of all these elements, they aim to provide a feeling of how the Blue Humanities operates. These ideas surge and reward immersion, at the expense, I think, of a little bit of confusion, perhaps. As the American poet Charles Olson rhapsodizes in his epic The Maximus poems, published in 1983, we must go in, the bowsprit, bird, the beak, in, the bend is in, goes in, the form. For Olson as Maximus, looking at the Atlantic coastline just a little bit up to the northeast from where I live, as for many other Blue Humanities thinkers, to go in means to confront waters and their meanings not just with ideas, but also with our bodies, and sometimes with pieces of technology like boats or maybe scuba gear or surfboards. So most of the talk that I'll be giving to you guys today comes from the book's preface. And the freshwater body in the preface is my body. The physical property in the preface are my local tides in Long Island Sound. But since the tides slosh around all of the planet in time with lunar gravity, these are your tides too, wherever you are. Here in Munich, or at home with Christoph on the shores of the Starnberger See in Tutzing, or with Michael in his home in Queensland in the South Pacific. Tides are largely invisible or unmeasurable, except in oceans and a few very large lakes, but all bodies of water respond to the moon's pull. Even the water in my body and in yours shifts in microtidal patterns. In juxtaposing the water that makes up roughly 60% of my body with the forces that move vast basins of salt water across the surface of the planet, this preface aims to foreground the interpretive challenge posed by multiple scales. Water surrounds us, in our bodies, in our neighborhoods, and on our planet. The core intellectual challenge of the Blue Humanities explores how water functions in and across multiple scales. How does the water that seeps out of a sewer grate at high tide connect to the water that nourishes my muscles and flesh? How might either of these two small bodies of water speak to the vast circulations of the ocean basins? Gear slipping shifts between inside and outside, salt and fresh, solid, liquid, and vapor represent interpretive puzzles. Making sense of disorienting movements across scales and spaces captures the pleasure and the ambition of the Blue Humanities. We who are swimmers, sailors, or simply humans who drink and wash our bodies know the sensation of water on skin. The touch pleases, but it also carries a hint of alienation because land mammals cannot live in water. The variable opposition between the wet and the dry has long been at the heart of my thinking about blue environments. In Shipwreck Modernity in 2015, I explored wet narratives that emphasize disorder, disorientation, and rupture in dialogue with a dry counter-movement that attempts to make sense and meaning out of disorder. The contrast between wet swirl and dry structure operates as a fundamental tension within Blue Humanities thinking. The conceptual distinctions between experience and knowledge and the felt difference between feeling and form flow alongside the contrast between the wet and the dry. To be wet, to be in Olson's emphatic word, generates an experience and distinctive feelings. Drying is the slower process, an imposition of form and accumulation of retrospective knowledge. Even though getting wet may feel binary and abrupt as cold water shocks flesh on a hot day, these two states coexist in tension with each other. The movement of water into and through bodies trickles through many paths, forking often, sometimes unpredictably. The process through which water moves between bodies, which ecotheorist Daisy Alaimo describes through her term transcorporeality, and which I've previously theorized through the verb seep, resists any absolute distinction between wetness and dryness. On the driest days, our bodies remain full of water, and so does our planet, even though both droughts and floods disrupt human communities. This book shows how the felt opposition between wet immersion and dry terrestrial living operates in tension with the broader sense in which water touches everything. It's in our body's cells, in our food and flesh, in the Earth's crust, and even, scientists tell us, frozen within interstellar comets. The burden of the Blue Humanities seeks to follow water's sinuous trails wherever they flow, and also to trace their dampness in our environments and our memories. Writing, thinking, and creative work that flies the flag of the Blue Humanities responds to water's intimate paradoxes in many modes, from poetry to literary criticism to history, environmental writing, and religious scholarship. The book's second chapter, Blue Humanities Thinking, sketches out a large but still partial list of over 200 articles, books, edited collections, special journal issues, courses, events, and related projects that have appeared in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And if you follow my Twitter feed, you'll see more coming sort of on a weekly basis, usually. Because of my own training, the book will lean heavily on literary texts and literary criticism, mainly but not only written in English. Literary culture, as I present it, aims to be less a narrow specialization than a bridge discourse, to make water-infused ideas accessible for thinkers in many modes. We all read stories. Many of us read and write poems, and the connective tissue of literary culture can, perhaps, form links between disparate modes of analysis and argument. In emphasizing literary studies, I don't mean to decenter the scholarship of historians, ecologists, geographers, anthropologists, philosophers, marine biologists, and many others, including many people in this room, from whom I have learned and continue to learn so much. Rather, it is my hope that a non-technical presentation of literary texts, including canonical figures such as Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, and Herman Melville, as well as newer voices such as Edward Glissant, Craig Santos Perez, and Monique Rofi, can provide modes of access for many disciplines. At the core of this understanding of literature as a bridge sits the overdetermined figure of the white whale in Moby Dick. Whenever I meet someone who works with water in almost any way, a yachtsman, a fellow swimmer, a marine biologist, a NASA scientist interested in water on extraterrestrial asteroids, a few weeks ago in Tutsing, the historian Bathsheba DeMuth, it's almost always true that Moby Dick sparks an affinity. Readers of Melville recognize that the book contains multitudes. It's a South Sea adventure, a cetacean natural history, a vehicle for Calvinist rage, political allegory, Shakespearean pastiche, gay romance, and quite a bit more. A recent comprehensive literary critical study of maritime literature, a poetic history of the oceans, published in 2022 by Søren Frank from the University of Southern Denmark, uses Melville as a kind of central test case for the ways in which Western literature represents the ocean. For me, as for Frank, Moby Dick represents the ur-text of the human encounter with the global ocean, at least in a Western context. Rather than following Frank's lead and orienting my study around a kind of central investigation of Melville, however, my book will deep briefly into fragments from Moby Dick. I hope to spur readers back to Melville, or perhaps to Melville for the first time, and to other texts with new blue vigor. But I also want to talk today about a primary text from the preface. And at the risk of making this talk a little bit indulgently self-referential, the primary body of freshwater was, remember, my body. And the primary literary text is actually a poem that I wrote, which is in the Swim Poems volume, which came out earlier last month that I forgot to bring with me today. But I really wrote it for this event, the Swimposium, which I was unable to attend in the summer of 2021 in Dublin, Ireland. The poem also recently, so yes, I said the poem already recently appeared. Here's a picture of the poem, that chapbook that I forgot to bring. My poem takes its title from a durational art project, Swimming a Long Way Together, organized by my friend and Blue Humanities inspiration, the open water swimmer and artist videographer Vanessa Dawes. Her project explores the legacy of British long-distance swimming pioneer Mercedes Gleitze, who in 1927 became the first woman to swim the English Channel. The title of Dawes' project and my poem, which you probably can't read up there on the slide, is Swimming a Long Way Together. And I'll just read it here. To be together, immersed in wetness, in splashing arms in rotation, to catch the water, cup and hold, to pull endless flowing the sea backward and me to match leaning forward, through, in, past, and into the deep blue. Free. I and the wonder world circumperegrinate to rendezvous inside the world sea, light bender, dream world. You are here too, swimming with me for a long way. Can't see where we're going. Arms churn circles and hands cup the salt sea. Emptiness around, flowing, unknowing. To school like fish in silver mail so bright, from each day's dawning, straight on to the night. This poem, which I also recorded with a musical background for Dawes' project, though I don't have that recording with me right now, reimagines the solitary experience of swimming in the ocean as a collective art. The poem isolates three fundamental principles of Blue Humanities practice: physical contact with the water, disorientation, and the emergence of a new collective. The story is hyper-local and personal. It's really about my physical sensations when I swim in the ocean. But these principles of contact, disorientation, and collectivity operate across multiple scales, not just in my individual scale. Blue environments disorient and reform collectives on the levels of community, nation, and beyond to post-human networks. They function on planetary scales, structuring the movements of human and non-human populations. But especially in this poem and for this book, we start with the body. It's not easy to capture in words the feeling of saltwater immersion. The poem holds up the swimmer's efforts to catch the water, cup and hold, as I try to follow a long ago swim coach's impossible advice to grab the water with my cupped hand and pull it backward, which of course doesn't work, because that's not the way water works. Moving through the water entails sliding forms exchanging places with each other. Flowing the sea backward and me to match, leaping forward. As my body pushes into the water in front of me, the sea swirls in behind me to fill up the vacancy. Liquid water always moves, always responds to things moving inside it. To feel oneself in this element, to move in a practiced way that guides one's body toward a desired goal, this feeling and the form that enables it remakes a terrestrial animal. In the poem's concluding couplet, I want to school like fish. This fish school represents the collective that I aim to build, a school of blue knowledge. But the watery experience always wriggles free. The prospect of fish being a water breather whose physical capacities will always exceed my own, brings me up against the limits of my aquatic embrace. I love immersion, but I can't live in the water. For a brief time, as my body enters the watery environment, my capacity to orient in space changes. I feel free from gravity's tug, but the fluid medium disorients. Inside the world-sea, light-bender, dream world, my senses falter. Vision becomes distorted. Sound and smell lose specificity. Touch hypertrophies as my skin vibrates to the surging passage of salt water. Can't see where we're going, and since humans lack the echolocation capacities of marine mammals, I swim with little guidance. Keeping a straight path is a technical challenge for open water swimmers, though mostly an annoyance for a meditative amateur like me. I feel the water around me, flowing, unknowing. My experiential world narrows, distorts, and refocuses on buoyancy and motion. Dawes' Swimming a Long Way Together project includes multiple art installations, public swims, films, and conversations at different venues in Ireland and the United States. And I think there's a couple more coming up next year as well, following the itineraries of Mercedes Gleitze. My poetic contribution, sent across the Atlantic in lieu of my body in August 2021, builds toward a poetic dream of collaboration. I want to be able to school like fish, to be an aquatic creature in a knowledge-building collective. To construct that unity in time, from each day's dawning straight on to the night, represents a difficult, perhaps impossible task. Immersion creates communities, but when you're in the water, there's a visceral solitude, a shock of being a land mammal out of place in the world. Art, like swimming strokes and intellectual discourses, builds and I might also say like academic centers, like the Rachel Carson Center, builds communities through shared experience. My aim in this book is to provide for readers something resembling the communities that Vanessa Dawes and other collaborators have been helping me discover. All right. Now we're going to zoom back out to the larger picture and not be quite so focused on me. Scholarship in the blue humanities during the early decades of the 21st century has been dazzled by oceanic vastness. As former RCC fellow Helen Rozwadowski frames the subject in her book Vast Expanses, published in 2018, the world ocean comprises the dominant feature of planet Earth. And I love the clarity and simplicity of that sentence. The massive circulating systems that connect all the salt water basins on our planet have captured the attention of scholars and thinkers in multiple fields. As ocean-focused scholarly discourses have been maturing, attention is radiated out from oceans to include rivers, lakes, glaciers, and many other forms of water. The rapid growth of blue scholarship across literary studies, environmental history, anthropology, art, eco-materialist theory, and related discourses has produced a riot of intellectual plurality. As the seas rise, oceanic scholarship spills its bounds. I have suggested in an article that was e-published just last month when I was already here at the RCC that these intellectual discourses can be conceptualized under the rubric of a poetics of planetary water. The flexible and speculative nature of this concept aims to respond to global concerns in our eco-catastrophic times. The goals of watery criticism, to adapt a familiar phrase, include both describing the complex workings of water and also imagining ways to change our relationship to it. While many neologisms have been proposed, from hydrocriticism to critical ocean studies to ocean history, the sub-discourses of environmental studies and literary studies seem mostly to have settled onto the blue humanities, although I suspect that many of these other terms will remain in circulation. But what exactly is or are the blue humanities? And now I want to come back to this question about the singular and the plural. So it should say what is or are the blue humanities on the top there. I don't know what happened to the slide. Anyway, you remember what it says. The term poetics and the term humanities functions in English as both a singular and a plural. As I employ these terms, I tend to use each of the words, both humanities and poetics, as a singular collective. So I would say a poetics of planetary water aims to clarify the relationship between humans and waters. Or I would say the blue humanities combines, again taking the singular verb, blue water with human ideas. I'll investigate the singular plurality of these terms today by looking closely at the word poetics. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us that in English, poetics has historically taken both singular and plural forms. The word's most important meaning for my purposes names a, quote, theory of form. That's OED definition 1b. This usage usually takes a singular verb, although in certain ways hints of plurality still cling to the concept. In a broad sense, my use of the term echoes Aristotle's descriptive approach, in which the philosopher explains what poetics is by observing the examples he has to hand. The key term for Aristotle, as for me, is mimesis, or a system, or modes of imitation. Aristotle builds his structures out of readings of Homer and Greek drama, while I splash around with a wetter range of exemplary texts. But Aristotle's observation that poetics combines pleasure and pain seems noteworthy for a blue humanities focus on watery allurements and threats. Aristotle emphasizes the pleasure of representing something that can be painful. Though the objects themselves may be painful to see, he writes, we delight to view the most realistic representations of them. The pleasure that emerges from threats of pain represents an important element of blue aesthetics. A blue poetics always engages the awkward fit between humans and water. We depend upon it and love it, but it cannot be our home. The human-water relationship occupies the realm that Aristotle names poetics, in that it is distinct from the purely human world that Aristotle theorizes as politics, or the science of the polis. There is not the same kind of correctness in poetry, the philosopher writes, as in politics. The pleasure-pain of poetic order instead asks humans to touch and engage more than human beings and systems. My aim in blue humanities thinking is to construct a poetics of planetary water that employs all the flexibility and dynamism of the term poetics. So, instead of now dragging you through a very long bibliography or detailed textual analysis, both of which things we'll be able to find when the book comes out, I promise, I'm going to round out this talk with 3 images, which I think are useful to visually represent some distinctive ideas in the blue humanities, including the emerging turn from the Atlantic to the Pacific and some long-standing efforts to think about global climate change and ocean pollution. So the first one, which you can see most of, I guess it's slightly cut off on the slide, is a small acrylic painting that Vanessa Dawes made for me back in 2019. The image accompanied a workshop and public lecture that I gave at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland that winter. The title of the painting, pluralized the Anthropocene, with an I forgot the exclamation point. There's supposed to be an exclamation point there. Pluralized, like you got to do it now. And the riot of unsettling colors in this image together create sensations of crisis and uncertainty, as well, I hope, as a little touch of seasickness, especially if you look at it for a long time. Dawes paints here a boat full of faceless souls, perched precariously on a wave that is itself full of stormy ocean trash. Atop the mast, a single figure peers downward toward murky water, and behind the ship, the tail of a monstrous beast seems about to strike. The sea monster is modeled on a creature that decorates a celebrated 17th century European atlas, and Dawes found this image and copied this image from the flyleaf of a first edition of Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us. The painting represents the 21st century Anthropocene ocean as we have broken it and filled it with trash. This space has become hostile to humans and hard to endure, but it still pulses with an eerie attraction. This ocean is not only blue, many other colors are obviously present, and it may be better understood as the prismatic, in Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's use of that word, or multi-hued subject of the blue humanities. The painting represents alien oceans in which terrestrial mammals cannot easily thrive. With the crowd of sailors, we fear the waves. With the solitary figure on the masthead, we cannot see as far ahead as we would like. Next image is a Blue Humanities logo, which was made by T.J. Piccirillo, American graphic designer and my Short Beach neighbor. He created this for me in the early months of 2021. This image presents a kind of hopeful counterpart to some of the anxiety of Dawes' painting. The logo echoes the global view of the Earth, made famous by the blue marble photograph taken by the crew of Apollo 17 in 1972. But I also asked the designer on this particular image to center the Pacific Ocean. Australia and New Zealand are visible in the lower left, and the northern coasts of North America and Asia frame the upper half of the image. If the image quality is good enough, you can probably make out Korea, Japan, and several other large Pacific land features, including Borneo and New Guinea. But the empty blue heart of this image is the vast Pacific itself, here depicted without famous islands such as Hawaii or Tahiti. The image highlights the planetary ocean, and it pushes human settlements all the way to the margins. The inhuman great waters occupy the frame. In important ways, the dehumanized content of this image is historically false. The central waterways of the Pacific have been sites of human travel and settlement for millennia, as poets and scholars and historians of Oceania have told us, and as I take up in the book in chapter 3. But since we so often see maps that put land at the center of the image we are presented with, I wanted in this image to put the ocean at the center. The Blue Humanities aims to keep the dominant feature of the planet at the center of our attention. The third and last and weirdest image is highlights the oceans even more dramatically, and I hope you can sort of make sense of it. It's pretty hard to see. This is a view of the world ocean as a single connected body from the point of view of the South Pole. It is known as the Spillhouse projection. It was designed by the South African-born oceanographer Athelstan Spillhouse in 1942, and it centers the ocean while marginalizing the land. The large continents of the Americas and Asia appear just as little fringes on the top of the map, and the continents of Antarctica and Australia show as islands in the blue water of the Southern Ocean. Even Africa, which looks island-like in this projection, occupies only a relatively minor place, although it is close to the center of the image. From a blue humanities perspective, the view from below, from the South Pole, captures the unity of the great waters. Spillhouse, whose academic career included stints at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts and at the University of Minnesota, created this map to emphasize the interconnectedness of the watery part of the world. The map inverts common northern hemispheric projections, including the famous Mercator projection, that center populous lands of Afro-Eurasia and sometimes of North America as well. No two-dimensional projection of the three-dimensional globe is correct, of course, since all involve distortions to represent curved space on a flat surface. But the Spillhouse projection seems especially illuminating because it highlights the water's dominance of our planet's surface. While this body of water is perforated by Antarctica and Australia, it presents a blue core at the center of this strangely shaped world. Spillhouse provides an explicitly anti-human projection of the globe, with three of the most populous continents, Asia, Europe, and North America, appearing only as ragged fringes. Even Africa, the site of humanity's origins and today home to its fastest growing populations, appears slightly off-center. These three images, like this talk and eventually the book, participate in efforts to define the blue humanities. Over the years, many scholars including me, have hazarded a variety of short definitions. The blue humanities represents a form of literary and cultural criticism that puts water at the center. It poses a blue counter-challenge to the obsessively green visions of eco-criticism. It puts water where the land used to be. It is animated by efforts to craft new vocabularies and critical methods to enable richer connections between humans and water in all its forms. Like any robust scholarly or artistic collection, this discourse is plural, and we are on the open sea where no one owns anything. The positions made visible in these images, including the ship as catastrophe and the ocean as non-terrestrial vastness, represents poles with which blue humanities thought oscillates. Like many blue humanities writers and thinkers, I find something enticing about the wild blue. Some of these alluring questions are the same thing that makes the human experience of the ocean painful. The sea down the street from me in Short Beach, where I swim every day between May and November when I'm home, is the same sea of troubles on which the transatlantic slave trade floated, and into which the bones and bodies of suffering humans have been and continue to be consigned. Blue waters represent difference and capacity, or perhaps it is clearer to say that they represent difference as capacity. To engage with the blue means to at least provisionally step outside of familiar land-based concerns. Sometimes that is a welcome or a refreshing change, and at other times it can feel catastrophic. So at one point I had a much longer conclusion, and I am drawing on a 75,000 word manuscript, so I could be here for a very long time. But instead I decided I would just close things up with some questions that I have sort of for you, and also reflecting back to me and for the discourse more broadly about how blue scholarship might develop in the future. If we want, we can use these as a jumping off point in the Q&A, or you guys can take that in whatever direction that you'd like. But since at the moment I still have the microphone, we'll start with my questions. The first one, how can the blue humanities shape our experience of the Anthropocene? And this strikes me as the big question, right? The bringing together of the blue humanities and the Anthropocene. And sometimes when this is posed to me, I answer it with kind of a joke, that one of the things about sea level rise means like we're going to be seeing more water and a lot closer to us all the time. And then sometimes I think about it and I think that that's maybe not a joke. But so I'm sort of looking for a better answer to that question, I guess. Second, what kind of globalization is wet globalization? Wet globalization is one of the terms I use to think about the circulation of bodies, humans, animals, viruses, languages, cultures, especially in the early modern period. And I'm thinking here in particular about how the wet globalization of the blue humanities might relate to economic globalization and even to neoliberalism. And I'm thinking in dialogue here with a great recent chapter by Elizabeth Delafrey, another RCC former fellow. Third, how will sea level rise and increased flooding change how we imagine and experience water in the near future? I'm thinking about the next 10 or 20 years. And this is in some ways, I think, a less flippant version of the joke that I started with before about sea level rise. But I think it's a crucial question for neighborhood planners, urban planners, architects, landscape designers, and also for poets, filmmakers, philosophers, literary critics. Finally, how does the blue humanities help us think about the contrasting utopian and dystopian futures that we, I think, often find ourselves faced with when we think about environmental questions in the future? And I'm thinking here about the wonderfully hopeful and utopian elements, especially of Michael's and Akin's talks earlier this semester, and I'm sorry that I missed Tamara's. But I was thinking about, I'm also basically a happy person and a hopeful person, but I also wonder about what tragic notes might do to complicate and further enrich our conversation. And I do have, I put it up on the slide too, a kind of short literary answer to that last one, which has to do with the language of genre and the ways in which comic and tragic modes always are in a kind of competitive interpenetration with each other, influencing each other and creating things, hybrid forms like tragicomedy. But that's like a boring technical literary critical answer, and I suspect it's not the thing that you guys most want to talk about. So I will turn it over now to you guys for the Q&A. Thank you.